Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is Christopher Loring Knowles, and he's been kind of on my radar. People have sent me his material from his blog, which he's been writing for 15 years. The blog is secretsun.blogspot.com. Great information there. Highly recommend people check that out. But during my research, I come back around and somebody will send me a post or something. So I've been aware of him, so I'm delighted to have him on the show to talk about his most recent book, which is superb. I really read through most of it, like 2/3 of it today. Title of the book is The Endless American Midnight, Dispatches from the Secret Sun. And it was originally published in 2020. I think he updated it recently. And he's done just superb research and talked to people I wish I had talked to, like he has a conversation with Bobby Bouzoulet, who I researched for some of my work. But his full bio is at the end of this book. I'm just going to read through it in some of the other books he's written. Christopher Loring Knowles is the author of the novel He Will Live Up in the Sky, as well as the Eagle Award-winning Our Gods Wear Spandex, The Secret History of Comic Book Heroes, and The Secret History of Rock and Roll, The Mysterious Roots of Modern Music. He's the co-author of The Complete X-Files, Behind the Series, the Myths, and the Movies. He was an associate editor and columnist for the 5-time Eisner Award-winning Comic Book Artist magazine, as well as a writer and reviewer for Classic Rock magazine. He's appeared on ABC's 2020 and VH1's Metal Evolution, and several radio shows, including National Public Radio and The Voice of America. He has also appeared in several documentaries, such as Wonder Woman, Daughter of Myth, and The Man, the Myth, Superman. He has also lectured on science fiction, mysticism, and mythology at the legendary Esalen Institute at Big Sur, and he regularly blogs on the Secret Sun. So I'll put those links in the show notes so you can check it out. But today we'll talk about this book. Title is apropos. I think he writes in his book, I was reading through this, he says there's kind of like I don't remember the exact phrase that he used, but there's kind of like a secret haunting of America or of himself, of all this really heavy stuff that's happened in the United States. And I think he includes a lot of that in this book. But Christopher, people who don't know your background or may not have read your other books, can you kind of talk about what led you to kind of compile this book, The Endless American Midnight?
Well, people have been asking me for years to do so, to put a lot of the Secret Sun stuff together. A lot of the stuff I've done has sort of been like, symbolic analysis, and that would entail using a lot of copyrighted material that I wouldn't really have access to. So I concentrated on more the essays, more of that kind of material. But, it had a very pointed mission, because when I first put the book together, it was during all that nonsense during the summer of 2020. And, just kind of watching this whole situation come undone. But also, like my primary area of interest is, the culture and how all these greater movements and greater powers influence the culture and how that expresses itself in the culture. And I think that anybody at this point in time is going to look at our culture and just see that it's very, very sick. And it's, it is haunted. We're really at a point in time now where we don't have a culture, we don't have a society really, and the stories that we tell each other are all very sick and weird and contrived. There's this whole movement towards like wokeness and everything like that, and that was like a real big focal point for me, was just to see how this stuff has really been feeding into the culture, because all this, I'm sure and I'm sure your listeners know, is that all this wokeness kind of stuff, it's all very top down. It's all coming from, the C-suites. It's all coming from the highest echelons of finance and international relations. It's this very strange agenda. But there's also the issue of how social media is affecting people. We just had a very strange situation right now, and I'm a grandfather now, so I really have skin in the game. I have 3 kids and I have a grandchild now. So I'm very concerned about the future because, I've sort of staked my claim in the future. And I'm just trying to analyze and get a handle on how we've become so sick and what's led to that. And one of the things that I've been very focused on over the years is, all these various kind of intelligence operations that have moved the culture and have poisoned the culture in very many ways. And that's why I have a big thing on the Manson issue. You talked about my interview with Bobby Beausoleil. I'd interviewed him from prison for a piece that I had done for Classic Rock back in 2005. And, to me, like, it just seems to me that all this has become, I don't want to say more relevant, because, certainly the Manson thing has less of a hold on the culture. But I mean, look at Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I mean, big hit movie, just came out a couple years ago and sort of brought that up. But the thing that I was really concerned about with the Manson material was the process, and how that, seemed to be this silent player behind the scenes that weaves through all these kind of events, and, where their money came from and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And you also keep the theme is MK often keeps popping up in your book too, which is, can you talk about that and what Bobby Beausoleil was like? A lot of people don't know, and you mentioned this in your book, that he was friends with Kenneth Anger, which I think is a very important piece of the whole Manson saga that some writers don't note, but you did.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting because we had this whole situation, and again, like, the process shows up in Mayfair, which is, that's the ritziest area of London, right? The most expensive real estate in London, and how somehow they would be able to afford a townhouse with a bowling alley and a cinema and everything in it. And then they start setting up in, Boston, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, but also New Orleans. They're down in the Gulf of Mexico. They're down in the Bahamas. If you read between the lines, it gets pretty easy to see what's behind that situation. MK Often. Okay, so MK Often is a very controversial topic, and there are a lot of people who have a lot of different takes on it. And I sort of follow on the idea that it was a ancestor, or, it was a program that arose out of the dissolution of the original MK Ultra project. And it seems to me that if you look, say, at the year 1966, when it's believed that MK Often split off as its own sub-project, you start to see, obviously, Kenneth Anger shows up in San Francisco. He's getting money from the Getty Foundation. He's getting money from the Ford Foundation. Bobby Beausoleil shows up there. They're living at the old Russian embassy near Haight-Ashbury, which is, very expensive building, very expensive piece of real estate. Manson gets out. He's sort of bopping around. Anton LaVey sets up shop, again in San Francisco. And then, there's this witch from England who starts getting on all the talk shows, this woman named Sybil Leek. And it just seemed to me that I was looking at, it's a kind of thing where you need to, it's deductive logic, because you sort of need to look at the gaps. I mean, there's so little information known on this, and there's a lot of controversy about this topic. But I was going on the idea that there's this project to sort of disseminate all this black magic and satanic and, slasher movies start up at the same time, really. It almost seems like a poisoning of the culture that I think was very much not in line with, like, what was going on in 1966, 1967, which was, flower power and peace and love and all these kind of things. And all of a sudden you have this very dark material being disseminated in what seems to be a very coordinated fashion. And that, was very troubling to me. And this is something that I had done a lot of work on back in 2016. And I started looking at all these strange things, like the premiere of Night of the Living Dead during a children's matinee in Chicago, which had a very strict board of censors. And Roger Ebert had, went there. He was at that premiere, and he sort of described this whole nightmare scenario of all these kids who are getting dropped off by their parents, to watch, Bugs Bunny cartoons, are all being, severely traumatized by this movie. And it seemed to me that this was, a very deliberate experiment to see how these very young children would react to this kind of material. And also sort of taking it up to, The Exorcist in the early 70s, because I was looking at William Peter Blatty, who seems to be part of this orbit in many ways, because he was in the U.S. Information Agency, but he was also a psychological warfare expert for the Air Force. And then I was looking at the early showings of The Exorcist, and all this hysteria and all these kind of symptoms that people were displaying that they would not display at later showings. And it very much looked to me like they were experimenting with subsonic weaponry that they were also using at this very same time in the field in Vietnam. So again, I mean, it's just kind of looking at all these kind of things that just don't seem spontaneous, and just all this very dark and disturbing material that's being disseminated out into the public, and trying to figure out why, what was behind this. And I felt, very strongly, and this is research that I need to continue with, but I felt very strongly that there was a project behind this. There was a program behind this, that this was not spontaneous, that this was not just some outpouring of, some sudden enthusiasm for, serial killers and all this kind of stuff, because, Dave McGowan had talked about how, the whole serial killer phenomenon really starts up at the same time. And that to me doesn't seem accidental either. It just seems to me that there was definitely an agenda here. There was definitely a program. And, I wonder if it had some sort of connection to, say, the Gladio program. Just very much like, an infiltration of society as a whole with just very dark and destructive archetypes and so on.
But it changed. Like if you talk to people in the early 60s, there was a real peace and love was really the theme. It got darkened later on, Altamont and Manson.
Mm-hmm.
But so if you talk to those people who were in the mid 60s when they were fighting against Vietnam, and that was an interesting aspect of your conversation with Bousselet, as he said, it was all done in the backdrop of Vietnam, this really vicious, unnecessary war. But there was a marked change, almost like it says, and there was I highlighted a sentence from your book, which you say, you see it as a long-running occult war on the American people being waged by powerful lunatics within the intelligence community. So yes. I think that there's a basis in fact for that. There's a lot of other things going on too. DeFreeze and the Symbionese Liberation Army in California, Jim Jones, which definitely had an intel background. All these guys are intel. A great book by Brad Schreiber, Revolutions, and I always promote it, but people got to read that book. It's off the charts. But yeah, so
it's all interesting that it's all occurring within this I don't know, 50 or 60 mile radius around the Bay Area. But this is also where the work was being done in Palo Alto at Xerox PARC, and all this kind of technology that we're using now. There was a lot of Scientology that was very strong in those circles. Ufology, drug experimentation. And it just seemed like there was this very thick soup that was being made. And, again, like the whole phenomenon with the serial killers emerging from that. But one of the things that I was doing is that I was looking at all these charts, and I was sort of comparing, the rise and fall of the serial killer as a phenomenon. And it was almost directly correlative to the rise and fall of the slasher movies as a phenomenon. And, like people talk about things like the satanic panic. When people bring that up, I get very annoyed. Like it really bothers me because it's like, they don't even know what they're talking about. They don't even know what that means. They just read it somewhere in the New York Times or something. The thing I like to point out is that the satanic panic was originally manufactured by the mainstream media. It didn't grow out of like backwoods independent Baptist churches in the Appalachian Mountains. It grew out of offices in New York and Los Angeles. Specifically, Michelle remembers being published by St. Martin's Press, which was a huge, I don't know what they are now, but at the time they were a huge imprint, huge book imprint. And that really started the ball rolling. And then it's all like Geraldo and Sally Jesse and Phil Donahue and Oprah and all these kind of people that are keeping this thing moving. And then, people in the psychological establishment and everything like that. So they talk about this like this was like some sort of pitchfork uprising. But really, when you look at the exact history of it, people like, I don't know, like, what's his name? Bob Larson.
Oh, right.
All these,
evangelical angle to that story.
Yeah. I mean, they were really kind of riding the coattails of it. And again, I mean, this seemed to me like just part of this overarching program, that there was it, because I've always seen like Satanism and everything is like, it's a huge supply side thing. This people just aren't interested in Satanism, who aren't like, I don't know, like sex perverts or something or weirdos. It's not something that people are drawn to, even, like people will be drawn to the occult and everything, but Satanism, it's like always this weird thing, but it's always connected to intelligence or the police or some sort of security apparatus. I mean, for instance, LaVey was a snitch for the SFPD. And now we have the Satanic Temple, which has all these kind of CIA connections and so on like that. So it just seems to be like a very, a top-down thing. And that's what I saw when I was looking at this material connecting to MK Often, is that it just seemed like it was a very much top-down supply side thing. And I don't think there was this great hue and cry for this stuff until people sort of became conditioned with it, up until the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, no, it is interesting that all of that really sprang up in the late 60s, all at the same time in the same area. It's just incredible. California was kind of like the foundation of all these new ideas. And Scientology, really, if you look at what Hubbard's son said, Scientology is black magic just drawn out over a long period of time. Tons of Crowley involved in that too. But yeah, I mean, it really does show that there's just like, it's just an incredible event that all that Satanism had some kind of intel background. A lot of it.
Well, see, I get into trouble with a lot of people because when I talk about MK Ultra, I say like the technology for Manchurian candidates and, sleeper agents and all this kind of stuff, that's been known for a very long time, at least 1,000 years. The Ismailis in Syria, it kind of mastered that technology. And I don't believe that, people like Gottlieb and all these other people, that's what they were really after. I think that they had a much different agenda, that they were using the whole idea of, of mind-controlled assassins and things like that to basically get the funding. But I think that their agenda was, much broader based. I think they wanted to transform society as a whole. I don't think they were just interested in, creating this very small selective group of mind-controlled assassins. I think it was about, in some ways driving society insane and, making large amounts of people prepared, to be vessels for entity possession. And again, I mean, this is something I get in a lot of trouble with people when, I start bringing this up, the whole supernatural angle, but it's just the way I see things. And it's something that I've been looking at for a very long time, and it's like you said, I mean, I've talked to people like Beausoleil and everything like that. And, I've kind of seen the way the stuff operates from the inside a bit. And I just think that this was it's a much broader effort that I think is bearing fruit today. And that's part of the impetus behind this book, that I was kind of tracking this phenomenon over the years and how this has developed and what has laid the groundwork for this. I looked a lot like the whole thing with the skeptic movement and the scientism movement and the new atheist movement, and just realizing, wow, this can all be tied back to Jeffrey Epstein and his people, that he was funding most of those people. He was funding most of the skeptics and new atheists and so on. And there's this whole idea of creating like this scientific culture, and this is all very explicit in his circles, but I think that it was used by other people to kind of, I guess, sort of knock down any kind of remaining resistance to this grander and greater project, which is, a broader based societal transformation that has a very heavy supernatural component to it.
But wasn't that at the really inception of MK Ultra, the mind control? People think that they just wanted to touch one person's mind. I'm pretty sure they were thinking at a societal level, right? They
Absolutely.
were thinking, yeah. Okay, so that was one component of it, yeah.
Yeah, no, I believe that very strongly. And, one of the reasons I believe this very strongly is that I've gone back and read a lot of this material, and I've read a lot of, the original source material. And all these experiments that, say somebody like Cameron was running up in Montreal had absolutely no scientific basis at all. But it did have a basis in very ancient techniques around, say, creating, shamans and medicine men in tribal societies, things like drug use, sex abuse, sensory deprivation, certain kinds of ordeals and everything like that. Even the things with the depatterning with the tape recorders, that ties into the whole idea of mantras and so on. So if you really start to look critically at the methodology behind, somebody like a Ewan Cameron, it just has absolutely no scientific credibility whatsoever, but it does have a very ancient lineage that you can trace back to the occult and demonology, really.
Right, and I think that the original assassins, the name comes from Hashashin, so they were given massive amounts of hash, put in some paradise where they were given all earthly pleasures. So they were undergoing the ancient world's version of repatterning, depatterning, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. It goes back. I think, there are probably anthropologists who could trace this back to the Stone Age, right? Because we have examples of this, say, in isolated tribes in the Amazon and so on, or, when anthropologists were really starting to do their work, say, in the South Pacific back in the 20s and 30s and so on. We have observation of pre-technological societies that didn't have a great deal of contact with the outside world, and we see the practice of these methodologies. But it goes back in the ancient world. If you look at, I talk a lot about the Mithraic cults because I think they still very much exist, and it was the same kind of deal. It was initiation by ordeal. They just pumped these guys full of drugs, and they'd be raped and thrown in pits and drenched in bull's blood and all this kind of craziness. These ordeals that were meant to transform them, basically from the inside out.
It made me think of the Order of Nine Angles, right? When that section on Mithraism you had was like, that's what they do, is like they go through ordeals to create change, exeatic ordeals, and it's all based in all ancient Greek type stuff. So I was like,
it goes back very far. And I think the problem is that a lot of, I don't know, I guess a lot of people sort of don't connect the dots, because we have all these, it's almost like we have all these sort of freestanding disciplines where somebody's looking at, the occult, and somebody's looking at the ancient mysteries, and somebody's looking at, shamanism and drug use, and then somebody's looking at, more modern expressions of MK Ultra and Artichoke and Bluebird and then Paperclip. All these kind of things, this whole network of interlocking programs, and they don't really realize that it's all part of one phenomenon and that this has all been known. We live in this kind of secular post-Enlightenment culture where we've convinced ourselves that these things don't exist, or these, people aren't really interested in these things. It's just like some sort of weird, I don't know, sex fetish for them or something. And it's like, no, they are really interested in it because these techniques have been known for a long time, and these techniques accomplish what they're after,
Right. And I mean, going back to Epstein, it is interesting that you mentioned a lot of these guys are into all this like scientism. Kurzweil, you mentioned, uh,
Hmm.
so many of these other characters. And I was surprised at how much Lawrence Rockefeller popped up, and he was supporting many of these new age movements. I didn't know, but I know that he was supporting John Mack. And there's
Hmm.
a picture of him with Mack, but you see that.
All that UFO stuff from the 90s was all his money.
Wow,
Absolutely.
yeah, it's incredible.
But he was also behind Esalen and noetic sciences and integral studies, all these kind of the Zen Center. His money had really created this whole new age network of institutes in California that exists to this day, and still very influential to this day. And for instance, in the past 20 years or so, Esalen has really become a hotspot for Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is very much kind of taken that whole thing over in the same way that big tech money has taken over Burning Man. And it's interesting because, you hear about something like Bohemian Grove, right? And everybody's like, well, Bohemian Grove sort of started off as this thing for all these weird actors from the San Francisco theater district, as, kind of mock rituals and so on. But it was eventually, systematically infiltrated by, the upper echelons of the Bay Area, all these banking interests and so on. And the same thing's happening now with Burning Man. I mean, it's being taken over by, big tech millionaires and billionaires. Yeah.
Right, in Esalen, you've been to Esalen. I mean, it's a really incredible spot. Like, I don't know how they got that land, but you want to talk about the New Age tie-ins with Leary, Robert Anton Wilson, Manson, and all those people. I mean, you were there. I think you did. You see Graham Hancock there? Was it Valley? You were asked to speak there, right?
Yeah, I 2008 and 2009. And that was for the superpowers and the supernatural thing, because I had published Our Gods Wear Spandex, and Jeff Kreifel, who I'm friends with, was very interested in it. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's basically just like a new age resort now. And what I was interested in doing when I was there is kind of talking to the people who work there, and just sort of getting a sense of like, the people who see this place day in and day out, and, hanging around the kitchen at night and just hearing people talk and stuff. And, it was interesting because people were very disgruntled, because a lot of these people were kind of idealists, and they saw like how this thing was working from the inside. And a lot of these people actually started something was called Esaleaks. Esalen Leaks. It was a blog that existed, for a lot of these people that I was talking to, people who had been working at Esalen stuff and sort of blowing the whistle on the things that were there. But one of the things I didn't include this material in the book, but when I'd done the Secret Star Trek series, I was really looking a lot at how basically Esalen had been taken over by this channeling cult called the Council of Nine back in 1979, and they were basically, this channeling cult was basically running that place until I think about 1985, when Dick Price, who was a co-founder of the place, had a very mysterious and unfortunate accident just at a time when the Rockefellers were kind of looking at Esalen to be their venue for what they called hot tub diplomacy, when they started wooing a lot of these elements within the Soviet Union that really resulted ultimately in the Yeltsin era, the Yeltsin presidency, and that really came out of Esalen. But where did they get the land? Where did they get this this whole situation? I believe that the house was Michael Murphy, who was a co-founder. I believe that the property was in his family, but the seed money to set up like an actual institute and started inviting all these people, sort of these cutting edge psychological researches and so on in the 60s, that was all Lawrence Rockefeller's money. Absolutely.
It's incredible. It's an incredible piece of land. It's like one of the only pieces of, well, not, it's on the west side of the Highway 1, which going up to Big Sur, it's really something else.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. It really is. I'm not a big New Age guy. I'm not a big New Age follower. I have a lot of a lot of issues with the New Age, and it was interesting because I read a lot of these conspiracy theories and stuff, but I think a lot of the stuff that people had been talking about, I think that was really part of sort of that first flush. But I think once a lot of those people started to either die off or move away, a lot of these people who were MK Ultra alumni, particularly John Lilly and Andrew Pahowicz and all these kind of people, I think when they started drifting away from this whole situation, I think it just really just became ultimately a New Age resort. But, there was this really interesting period, that I talked about in that series when, this channeling cult, this, ancient astronaut kind of channeling cult is basically running the place for 6 years. And, the other thing is that there's all these kind of tie-ins with Star Trek and so on. And that was really interesting to me too, because when I actually went to Esalen, I was like, I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Star Trek Insurrection, but when I was actually at Esalen, it's like, oh my God, this is the same, this is the planet of the Baku in Star Trek Insurrection. I mean, that movie's just basically about Esalen. And then I went back and I just started looking. It's like, oh, Esalen's been part of Star Trek since the 60s, since the first season. And actually the Council of Nine have too. So, the Council of Nine, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with it, came out of this whole seance circle up in Maine. These sort of very rich eccentrics were involved with Pahowicz and also this guy named Dr. Vinod, this sort of mysterious guru-like character. So, I mean, this really starts off in the early 50s. And then there are all these like interesting chains of custody that, clearly show that connections between Esalen and the Council of Nine and later people like Uri Geller and so on. And it's a very interesting kind of mix. But like I said, by the time I was there, that stuff is all long gone.
It's all gone. But it is interesting because you mentioned in the book, this New Age movement is the number one religion in the world now, right? Or whatever, spiritual, but no, non-aligned or whatever you called it.
Yeah.
Spiritual, but not religious.
Yeah. You see, here's the thing. So if you ask most people, particularly people more our age, they'd be like, oh, well, the New Age is this thing that sort of happened in the 80s and 90s and then just sort of petered out. It's like, no, what actually happened is that it just completely took over the mainstream. And it's now so ubiquitous that we can't even recognize it anymore because, it's almost like like when your hair is growing, you don't notice as it's growing every day. And we didn't notice as the New Age just basically took over everywhere. That every major town has, like a Whole Foods and a yoga studio and a tarot card reader and an acupuncture place, and it's all the basic elements of the New Age as they existed, say in the 80s and 90s or back in the 70s even. And they're just everywhere now. It's become so widespread and so ingrained into the mainstream of our culture that we just don't even realize it anymore. It's really remarkable. And I think that a lot of people, there's always this kind of inclination to not take the New Age seriously, that it's kind of goofy and silly and just like kind of a thing for like rich housewives to be into. But, the rich housewives hold the purse strings in this economy. Don't believe any differently, So there you go.
Right. And it is interesting. And I think you also kind of key into the different classes, the Generation X's and these millennials, and how the challenges are much different for the younger kids, right?
Yeah. I got to tell you something. I think this sort of, one of the things when I talked about the chapter Real Life 80s Horror, when I was kind of deconstructing the whole idea of this satanic panic as just being this hysteria that just arose out of nothing, rather than, arose out of a very concerted 20-year effort to seed the culture with, again, with serial killer movies and the occult and Satanism. And then, what arose out of this is that we had a series of occult crimes starting in the early 70s, starting in the early 70s when, LaVey sort of is spreading his message far and wide. The thing I always say is that you don't need to worry about like Satanists when they're like in like downtown boho kind of funky artsy communities. You have to worry about Satanists when it spreads out into like the trailer parks and the ghettos and the barrios and
right, like Richard Ramirez, he was a perfect example.
Exactly. And I mean, this is something that I just get very irritated about because I've been sort of collecting news reports of satanic crimes since the early 2000s. And it's not a bigger a problem as it was, but it was a major problem when, like people like Marilyn Manson and everything were kind of spreading that message. And, I mean, it affects weak-minded people, people who are have a lot of psychological issues and are impressionable, when they see all this imagery and this whole message of just total license, they take it literally. They take it seriously. It's not art to them. It's not ironic. It's the way they want to live their lives. So, and the other thing too is that, I mean, you just hear all this knee-jerk stuff. It just drives me crazy. Like the whole thing about Dungeons and Dragons. You know what I mean? Well, role play was a huge part of a lot of these psychological warfare operations. That role play was taught, very much developed within these things. So role playing games. And the other thing, like I said, I mean, it's like people just don't look at the actual data at hand. And there was I don't know if it still exists, but there was actually a role playing game website from the early part of the 2000s that also compiled all these crimes that were, that you could connect to role-playing games and Dungeons and Dragons. And there were a lot of them. You know what I mean? There were a lot of them. It's like there are a lot of people who are just marginal people psychologically or spiritually. And, if you just immerse them in this kind of unreality, this world of unreality, which, like I said, comes straight out of these mind control programs, they're going to snap. That's just the way it is, And then when you start to look at, you mentioned like Scientology, like Scientology was being, taught in the prisons and stuff, and Manson sort of came out of that, and the process comes out of Scientology. Right. So it's just, you know what I mean? Right. It's just like,
oh man.
And
Manson, right? According to Bugliosi, Manson went into a Scientology center and said, "Is there anything else I can learn?" And they said, "You know everything. There's nothing else we can teach you."
Well, so there's the whole, and again, there's like military intelligence there because Hubbard was military intelligence. And then when I did some digging, with Jack Parsons and Marjorie Cameron, you find out that, not only was Marjorie Cameron naval intelligence, but she had top secret clearance.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, she was working. She was working in Washington D.C. during the war because she's an artist. She was working on the map making programs, and she had top secret clearance.
And that was interesting that you wrote that Bouzoulet went south and met her. So that's like an incredible tie-in too. So he didn't know just Anchor; he knew Marjorie Cameron.
Well, Well, Cameron was friends with Anger, right. And I had actually interviewed Anger. Around the same time I interviewed Bouzoulet. And, this was at a time when he was like, I think he was homeless and he'd been arrested for trying to strangle somebody and everything like that. I mean, this guy's in his 80s and he's still taking drugs and doing all this crazy stuff.
He was in a heavily ritual video with, I can't remember the actor's name, but yeah. I think
James Franco.
James Franco, yeah. Love in the old days.
Yeah. So it's just, I don't know. It just seems to be like there are these kind of networks. And I just think that they've had, this very deleterious effect on the culture at large, and part of it is just, the lifespan of cultures, the natural lifespan of cultures, the rise and fall of certain cultural paradigms. And we're sort of on the tail end of that. Excuse me.
Right. And I think you wrote they're constructing a giant techno kindergarten being constructed for us all the time, which is really scary, actually. Like,
yeah,
how
but
much we've
it's
been
not going to
affected.
work. It's not going to work. I mean, all these plans that like the Great Reset and all this smart cities, all this stuff is not going to work. I have absolutely no doubt that it's not going to work. The only question is like how many of the rest of us is it going to take down with us? You know what I mean? How many of the rest of us are going to be really badly affected because these plans aren't going to work because they can't work, and they also can't work because they're all based in like these science fiction fantasies. And, in science fiction, I used to be really, really into science fiction. And I kind of woke up, I kind of red pilled myself because I just realized that so much of the craziness in our culture today is like people having these science fiction expectations of what life is supposed to be like. There was actually this guy on Twitter, this sort of movie critic guy. And, he's saying if it wasn't for these Trump voters and everything like that, I'd be in my robot body on Mars and everything like that. And I'd be living forever and I could download my consciousness. It's like, no, none of that stuff will ever be real. None of it. The singularity, transhumanism, all this stuff is just science fiction fantasy of rich neurotics, people who have major psychological problems, have convinced themselves of all this absolute nonsense. You know what I mean? And it's just like I keep telling people, and people who've heard me a lot are going to be familiar with this, but it's like we've reached peak tech. Peak tech is in the rearview mirror right now. I mean, we reached peak tech a few years ago, at least, and we're on the downscale now. There aren't any new technologies waiting in the wings. They just aren't. And I think that we're seeing now with the whole globalist internationalist order starting to fragment and come apart. I think a lot of that is because there were a lot of people at that sort of Klaus Schwab, Bill Gates level who were being shined on by all the people who they were paying to create all these technological miracles for them. And they just assumed that they were based in reality. And I think sometime, a few years ago, they just realized, oh, wait, these people have just been lying to us for grant money. None of this stuff is going to exist. None of this stuff is going to work. And even if it does exist, it can't be scaled up. It can't be, it can't be made practicable because it's too expensive or it's too resource demanding. I mean, it's just like we can't actually do these things. And I think what we're seeing now, where it's just kind of like back to almost like the pre-internationalist order, it's because they realized that the technological miracles that they believed were going to smooth out this transition to this Jetsons kind of utopia it was all nonsense from the start. It was all just like science fiction nonsense from the start.
Science fiction mirage.
Mm.
Chris, do you have a time to take a few questions?
Sure do.
Do you, Babe Rebozo asked Chris to describe the Satan's tech theory and how it is stopped? Not familiar.
Oh, Lucifer's technology. So Lucifer's Technologies was a series I had done a few years back, and I was sort of looking at, I mean, you remember back in the 90s, all these sort of Roswell reverse technology, engineering kind of things. And I was kind of looking at that, but I was also looking at a lot of other information. And I really came to realize that that Roswell has all the hallmarks of a high occult magical working. I think it was all a very elaborate ritual that was, depending on your understanding or your belief in the supernatural, was to set the stage for a lot of these things, a lot of these discoveries or uncoveries or however you choose to describe them, that we're going to start filtering into the the culture, starting with the transistor at the end of 1947. But, again, I mean, that happened in Murray Hill, which isn't too far from here. And actually at Bell Labs, my wife used to actually work at Bell Labs. So, there was just this, it's a long story. It's like a 14, 15 part. It's basically a book length situation, but it's just basically looking at how the introduction of a lot of the high technology that we use today and we take for granted really was unveiled and sort of initiated or kicked off with a very elaborate occult ritual. And the thing, one of the things that I say is that when you look at the whole Roswell kind of deal, the whole Roswell mythology, it always sort of welled up back in the culture when there were major innovations in computer sciences. So the whole Roswell thing hits the culture, it hits the news services and everything at the same time that, the transistor is about to be released, but we also have a lot of these vacuum tube computers, ENIAC and UNIVAC and Whirlwind and all these kind of things. I mean, this was all new technology. And then the whole Roswell thing kicks up again in the late 70s with the rise of the home computer. I mean, this was a new thing, like the Apple and the Apple II and then the Macintosh. I mean, the whole Roswell thing's kind of showing up again, Stanton Friedman and Kevin Randall and all these kind of people are sort of seeding this back into the culture. And then it shows up again in the 90s with the rise of broadband internet and cell phones and so on. So it's just like, it seems to show up with what I would argue like a ritual recurrence according to things that are going on in, the technological realm, so to speak.
Interesting. Oswald Spangler asks, has Chris any change of mind that the endless American midnight will ever come to a head since you finished the book?
I don't know, man. We're in it. I mean, see, here's the thing though. It's like, you can choose to separate yourself from it. You can choose to take yourself out of it. You can choose to not engage in the world that is feeding this, the world of social media and so on. You can separate yourself from mainstream culture. It's not hard to do. And like I said, I mean, all these ambitious plans about this, this super police state, technological police state, those plans are very real, but they're all going to fail. And I just believe that with just utmost certainty that they're all going to fail because they just can't succeed. And they can't succeed because in order to run a high-tech society, you cannot have the kind of people living under that sort of very deadening, I hate to use the word feminizing, but it's just like a high-tech society really relies very heavily on risk takers, okay? And people who are willing to work very, very hard and at physical risk to themselves. I always point out like the fact that, you need people to get the phone lines back up during a hurricane or whatever, I mean, you need people to do like very dirty, unhappy work that in many cases is dangerous. And if you don't have those kinds of people, you can't run a high-tech society. You just can't. And, technological systems are not self-sustaining. They need to be constantly monitored and maintained and upgraded.
Interesting. And one question from me is, why is Jacob's Ladder your favorite film?
For very unhappy reasons, because it reminds me a lot of experiences that I had when I was a kid. So, I was in the hospital a lot and high fevers and hallucinations and all that kind of stuff. But I also was really fixated on the whole Vietnam thing for a long time. Like I watched Jacob's Ladder, I don't know, at least 100 times, but also Apocalypse Now I've watched about 100 times as well. Just like really fixated on those two movies. And I don't know if it's because I came of age during that era or for other reasons, but there you go.
Interesting. Me too. I just watched Full Metal Jacket again for like the 10th time. Like I'll just casually watch that again. Or Apocalypse Now, Final Cut, great movies. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen Jacob's Ladder in a long time. But I forgot that there's that theme. Wasn't that about them wasn't there supposedly in the Phoenix program some heavy duty drug that was supposed to drive the troops insane? Is that true? Was that a myth or is that?
Yeah, I believe it was true. I think it was STP.
Oh, that's right. STP, good memory.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you something. I mean, I was at this is back in the 90s, but I was invited. There was this sort of like speakeasy for ex-Marines, and my sister-in-law had a friend there, and he invited us there, and it was all these kind of old ex-Marines. I've been going back to, guys who fought in the South Pacific during World War II and so on. But at one point in time, there's this poster with all this Vietnam, vet lingo and all this kind of slang that they used during the Vietnam War and so on. And then he mentions Operation Phoenix, and like out of nowhere, turn around this guy who looks like he looks like Thor on a meth bender. I mean, it's just big, dark red, kind of ruddy face, like sort of grayish ginger hair, and just like a crazy look. And he just starts going on about Phoenix, and I like kind of realized, oh shit, this was one of the guys, because he starts talking about Phoenix, and he's kind of unleashing all this detail about Phoenix, and it's just like, how did he know this? And I was looking at him going, yeah, I can kind of see this guy as being. It was frightening, man. I mean, it was scary. This guy was not stable.
I had a guy who was a high school teacher who told like an Operation Phoenix kind of thing with the most graphic brutality, and we were like in shock in high school. I still remember that.
Yeah,
it's been so long, but there's a lot more in this book.
The Vietnam War was so horrible and just so worthless and unnecessary, and it's I think when you talk about the endless American midnight, and I think that it's a very interesting thing to see how like the rise of like programs like MK Ultra and I talk about, but also like the serial killers and all this other kind of really dark negative stuff that's feeding into the culture. Like you mentioned before, that Bobby Beausoleil said, that Vietnam was kind of like, it's the first televised war, and all this horrific imagery is being beamed into people's living rooms. I mean, that famous image of those little kids running from the napalm attack, just absolutely horrific. I think that war just really, I think that it broke something in us. I really do. I think it broke something like very crucial and important in our culture was broken by it. And I was just reading that there are these Vietnam War veterans who are moving to Vietnam, like they're retiring in Vietnam. And I just think that's so amazing to me, But
that's amazing. And you can do a time. There's probably a whole book on how many people became serial killers after being in Vietnam or I think it's like Leonard Lake, Richard Ramirez's brother was showing super graphic pictures. I mean,
oh god, yeah.
Leonard Lake and Robert Ng or whatever, those two crazies.
Yeah. Terrible.
We're at about 55 minutes, Chris. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before we wrap up this discussion about the endless American midnight?
I would just say, like, again, I mean, I have a very pessimistic attitude towards where we are going collectively. But like I said, it's something that you can decouple from. It's something that you can disengage from. Even it's just something just as simple as just disengaging from the public conversation as it stands, like today with all this Ukraine stuff and all this kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's not something that you can't get away from. It isn't like it's a soft totalitarianism. It's not a hard totalitarianism. But I think that it's going to get worse as, like I said, a lot of these plans, these longstanding plans that, can trace back to I don't know, Francis Bacon or whatever, are just not going to work. They're just not going to work. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind that they're just not practical. And I think a lot of the almost kind of panic that you're feeling at that elite level is the realization that these things aren't going to work. And again, I think a lot of it's based on the fact that they were sold a bill of goods by all their, tech and science guys who were just shining them on for grant money all these years and telling them that this is going to happen. This, we're going to have this and we're going to have that, and we're going to have all these superpowers and comic book superhero kind of technology. And, like I said, we've hit peak tech, and I think we're in for a long period of stagnation.
Interesting. And there's a lot more other themes in this book that you address: mysticism or mythicism, new scientism, which we didn't cover. A lot of your writings about movies and bands, and your kind of background in south of Boston. It was really interesting to read that too. What's the city that you grew up again? Remind me.
Braintree,
Massachusetts. Yeah, Braintree, Mass was in here. Just a lot of stuff of Graham Hancock. So I really enjoyed reading through the book. So thanks so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it. Oh, and also before we go, where can people get the book and social media contact? Do you have a website, or where can people reach out to you?
Yes, you can get the book on Amazon, and then just come to secretsun.blogspot.com, and that will, send you to all other kinds of places and so on. So, and I'm also on Twitter at Secret Sun Blog, and all sorts of other places. I have a Discord channel and a Facebook group and so on. So
definitely, and you're active on Patreon too, right? So you're posting stuff there too. So
yes, sir.
I'll put those links to the blog, Patreon in the show notes so people can check it out.
Thank you.
And again, sure. The Endless American Midnight: Dispatches from the Secret Sun by Christopher Loring Knowles. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, sir.
All right, take care. Stay there.